You're listening to Now It's the News. I'm Beowulf Rockland. Well, there was another big tech hearing on Capitol Hill this week. We remember Mark Zuckerberg earlier in the year coming in to face the music before potential regulators, and now the CEO of Google, Sundar Pichai, has done the same thing before the House Judiciary Committee. And Republicans and Democrats alike had a lot of questions, some of which were kind of basic, others of which were really serious and need to be answered. To discuss it with us is Alex Shephard with the New Republic. Alex, welcome to Now It's the News. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
There were a lot of lighter moments. Certainly one of them was Steve King apparently being unaware of the fact that Google does not make iPhones. Tell us how that particular aspect of this conversation came up.
Well, this happened over and over again in the hearing, where it seemed like almost everyone on the House Judiciary Committee had an iPhone and would sort of brandish it at Sundar Pichai, the Google CEO, and demand to know what Google is doing to their iPhone. Mm-hmm. But of course, Google makes the Android operating system. They are certainly present on iPhones, but to make it seem like they're the focal point of that piece of technology is both absurd, but also points at the sort of larger issue, which is that there's always an element in these hearings that these senators are treating these tech CEOs as if they're their grandchildren, and they're there to set up their brand new phones. And you get,
in fairness, they might be of about the same age. I mean,
yeah. I think statistically speaking, I'm sure that more of them probably have grandchildren than not at this point. But it does point to this sort of larger issue, which is more true. It should be said in the Senate than in the House. Mm-hmm. But that the level of literacy among our members of Congress when it comes to technology is not particularly high. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's pretty abysmal. Yeah. And you get these moments where particularly the Congress people who had been briefed by more intelligent or well-read staff members are trying to kind of combine things that they just learned in the last 12 hours with their pretty rudimentary understanding of how the thing in their pocket works.
Yeah, on a certain level, it's kind of funny and a little bit shocking. I know that Zoe Lofgren, I think she was kind of being tongue-in-cheek and maybe sending up some of the Republicans a little bit, talked about the idea of why when you search the word idiot, a picture of Trump comes up. And for anyone who has a basic understanding of how search engines work, you know that any picture or a picture of a popular person is going to be associated with a specific number of words depending on who puts that up on the internet and how they're labeled and what tags are attached to them and how frequently those are used, as opposed to it being a product of political bias by and large by the people who run the search engine. And yet in a lot of instances, what Republicans were doing, and they were doing some other things which we'll get into in a moment, were basically assigning this bias to Google and other big tech companies. Tell us a little bit about how that played out.
So, this was the ostensible purpose of the hearing, and I think House Republicans knew that this was their last chance. They've been pushing this idea that tech companies are sort of fundamentally biased against conservatives for quite a while. They're sort of, in some cases, calling for kind of affirmative action among tech companies to hire more conservatives. But they're also alleging, I think more importantly, that companies like Facebook and Google have purposefully set up their platforms, which are enormously influential, to steer users towards liberal content and steer them away or intentionally suppress conservative content. This goes back basically to the spring of 2016 when there was a report that the people that were editing Facebook's sort of news feed said that, oh, well, if we see an article from Ben Shapiro or The Blaze, which is then Glenn Beck's website, we won't put that in these trending topics, but we will steer them towards the Washington Post. And conservatives have seen this now, and they said that this is, the issue of our time that, we need to deal with, when, obviously tech companies' economic and cultural power is vast, but there is absolutely no evidence that there's any kind of, deliberate suppression of any political viewpoint.
We're speaking with Alex Shephard. He is with the New Republic. His article is Big Tech's Reckoning May Be Imminent After All. Now, the Republicans who control the Judiciary Committee went beyond just political bias specifically, and they were talking about data collection and what information Google has. And regardless of what side of the political aisle you're on, there are some serious questions about how a company, especially one the size of Google, how they go about collecting information, how much they collect, how much people are aware of that. And I know that that some of the folks on the committee asked some serious questions about that. Congressman Ted Poe, for example, said, I think the United States Congress needs to move in a direction to allow citizens to opt into the dissemination of their information rather than opt out. Tell us how this points towards perhaps a larger bipartisan movement towards the regulation of internet companies such as Google, specifically with respect to data collection.
Yes, I mean, the sort of the bee in Ted Poe's bonnet. I mean, it should be said that Ted Poe was one of the many Republican senators who brandished an iPhone while talking about Google. Mm-hmm. But Poe, who is kind of an interesting figure, he's a pretty conservative former judge from Texas. He has basically been advocating for a version of the GDPR, which was this wide-ranging piece of tech regulation that took effect in the European Union this fall, mm-hmm. For the United States to do something similar. And what GDPR does is really simple, right? It just says that if you're a tech company and you're collecting information, then people have to choose to give you that information. That essentially, if you are a user, you're an individual, you own the data that you put online. That's not the case here, which is, I think, pretty outlandish. But I think, a system like that where you're sort of opting in instead of opting out is, it's the foundation. It's a basic piece of tech regulation. And what we did see on Tuesday's hearing was a sense that both parties are becoming more comfortable with something like that.
So we've seen Democrats who are interested in following that path as well. This is not just Republicans perceiving a political opponent, perhaps, and looking to regulate. This is an earnest desire, as far as you can tell, for regulation of a large industry, which has fallen into the control of a few number of hands from both sides of the aisle.
Well, yeah, the dynamic's actually a little confusing because by and large, Democrats have been advocating for more regulation. In general, Democrats tend to be the party that advocates for the government to do more. But Silicon Valley, Republicans are not wrong about Silicon Valley being pretty liberal. These companies are both very active in terms of lobbying, but they've built really strong bases of power within the Democratic Party. Zoe Lofgren, who you mentioned earlier, represents Silicon Valley, and
right.
She basically acted as a human shield against charges of bias. In her 5 minutes of questioning. So I think one of the things that's sort of tricky and that becomes harder in part because of this imposition of this political bias narrative is that Democrats, I think, are still very touchy when it comes to tech companies. And that's why I think, we're not going to see large-scale regulation. I think my personal opinion is that, they should look into breaking up some of these companies. But I do think that what we did see on Tuesday was a sense that these two parties have become comfortable with the idea of a sort of GDPR-style data privacy package. And I think that Silicon Valley companies like Google and Facebook have also sort of become resigned to the fact that this is going to happen and have decided, they've upped their lobbying spending by 3 times in the last 12 months. They've decided that they want to play an active role in shaping that regulation.
We're speaking with Alex Shephard of the New Republic. Do you think that in this case, Democrats, because they represent a more liberal Silicon Valley and have financial ties to it, certainly, and because there's, regardless of whether there's an intrinsic bias in the algorithm of Google, whether because they perceive Republicans that Google is not with them politically, is there a sense that there is more of a desire, even if there's a broader consensus, more of a desire by Republicans to regulate and less of a desire by Democrats to regulate?
Well, I think this is another one of the more more confusing elements of this, but I think, part because Republicans are very uncomfortable with regulation. I think, when Zuckerberg was testifying in April, there Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana said, Mr. Zuckerberg, I don't want to regulate you, but I will. Mm-hmm. I think that they are becoming, partly because of this political narrative, this is the one time I think, that they'll feel comfortable regulating. Which I think you'll get at least a smattering of House Republicans voting with such a bill. The Senate becomes a little bit more of an interesting question, but it is strange because I think that it's not a real narrative. It's being pushed by folks like Tucker Carlson,
right.
But the political bias narrative is a way for Republicans to feel comfortable talking about the fact that they're uncomfortable with the kind of economic and cultural power that Google has.
Interesting. Well, maybe if they try regulation, they'll end up liking it. It was interesting to me that you mentioned in the article that Pichai and Google have both gone to great lengths to appease conservatives. How have they done that, and how have other tech companies done the same in the face of charges of political bias against the right?
Yeah, I think that I think it's the most shameful example, but Facebook basically commissioned this audit of their practices. Mm-hmm. It was going to be led by Senator John Kyle, who sort of stepped in to fill in for John McCain's seat and is, the swampiest, Republican you can imagine. He's a lobbyist as well. He's got to go back to lobbying when he leaves Congress on December 31st. Or at least the Senate, excuse me. Mm-hmm. And the Heritage Foundation participated in that as well. Sundar Pichai has met with a number of prominent conservatives. Twitter's Jack Dorsey has done the exact same with conservative media. They've spent enormous amounts of money on outreach and lobbying to try to convince Republicans of something that everybody knows is not true, right? Republicans know that there isn't some grand scheme to, manipulate Google search results. But I think, it's an example of how a kind of bad faith argument has just led to this enormously costly, moving of the Overton window, and that mm-hmm. we're spending all this time talking about political bias when, in fact, the political bias argument has always been a metaphor for a larger discomfort with, the role that a company like Google plays in our society.
Well, you may say that Republicans do not believe that there's some manipulation of the data, but I will tell you, and that may be true on a congressional level, but you go out in the rank and file, and it is believed by quite a few folks. So it's interesting the sort of propaganda beast that they have created. Now you say that the question is no longer whether Congress will enact regulation, but just how severe it will be. How severe do you think it will be?
I tend to be a cynic on this question. I think the headline of my story was, big tech's reckoning may be imminent after all. Mm-hmm. I've spent most of the year, I think for most of the year, the sort of conventional wisdom was that we were going to see a regulatory package mm-hmm. happen at any moment. Donald Trump has been very active in his, comments about Facebook and Amazon, a company that we haven't discussed. And yet, that never happened. I think, weirdly, the Cambridge Analytica scandal somewhat ironically pushed that conversation kind of onto the back burner because we were just talking about this one company and this one specific scandal for so long. Mm-hmm. But I think now, with the Sundar Pichai hearing, you started to see Democrats and Republicans coalesce around a pretty important, but also meager when you look at the scope of these companies' set of issues that largely relate to user control and data privacy. Mm-hmm. So I think that what I would bet on is a pretty lukewarm but still significant regulation package that focuses on sort of making it so you switch from an opt-out to an opt-in system, mm-hmm. and that I think what will be interesting is what comes after that, what the public's appetite is for regulation, if there is, particularly when you look at platforms like Facebook and YouTube, those things have come up later in these hearings, the idea that these platforms are both just hives of really depraved and often dangerous content. And I think that those are the kinds of more